Ryan left me for my best friend, Amber, on a Tuesday. Anger wasn't loud, it was clinical. 1 week later, a lawyer slid a folder across his desk. My late first husband, Thomas Holloway, had left me $77 million. But Thomas had instituted one strict condition. To claim the inheritance, I had to be legally single within 30 days. Have you ever been betrayed by the two people you trusted most? Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I left the lawyer's office and got into my car. The engine idled as I stared at the steering wheel. $77 million. But the money was secondary. The timeline was everything. 30 days. I drove home with absolute clinical clarity. For the past 5 years, I had been the silent investor in Ryan and Amber's version of reality. I was the one paying the rent. I was the one funding Ryan's endless string of failed startups. Now, I realized my marriage had been a subscription, with me footing the bill. People expect tears when a marriage ends. They expect shattered glass and screaming matches. I gave them none of that. It is the invisible chain of the survivor. When you endure years of subtle dismissal, you build a prison without bars around your own reactions. You learn that speaking up only brings more gaslighting, more exhaustion. That forced stoicism looks like weakness to predators. They mistake silence for submission. But my silence was never submission. It was a survival mechanism. The numbness they relied on to control me was exactly what allowed me to detach so completely. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. I just opened my laptop and started clicking cancel. I logged into our joint banking portal. Ryan had always treated our checking account as his personal venture capital fund. I transferred exactly 50% of the current balance to a new, secure account in my name only. I froze the remaining joint credit cards. I cancelled the autopay on his car insurance. I revoked his authorized user status on my primary accounts. I moved methodically, efficiently. Conflict at 11:51 at night. Retaliation complete by 12 o'clock midnight. Next, I drafted an email to a high-profile divorce attorney. I didn't want mediation. I didn't want counselling. I wanted legal severance, expedited and airtight. I attached the necessary financial documents and stated my primary objective. I needed to be a legally single woman within 29 days. Ryan and Amber were currently out celebrating their new life together, probably putting the drinks on a card I was about to dispute. They thought they had discarded a broken woman. They had no idea they had just untethered a very competent auditor. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon regret, but there was only clarity. This wasn't a breakdown, it was a balance sheet. I was systematically liquidating my emotional and financial investments in two people who had bankrupted my trust. I wiped the counter clean, my movements precise. I had spent years being the invisible wife, the background character in my own home. I was the editor who polished other people's narratives. Now I was editing them out of my life entirely. No hesitation, no negotiations, only immediate, decisive action. To understand the precision of my retaliation, you have to understand the 5 years that preceded it. I met Ryan when I was 28. He was charismatic, full of grand ideas, and utterly incapable of executing a single one. I was an editor, trained to fix mistakes, to structure chaotic drafts into coherent stories. I applied my professional skills to my personal life. I became the invisible architect of his existence. When Ryan wanted to launch a tech consulting firm, I wrote his business plan. When he needed seed money, I liquidated the modest savings I had built before we met. I worked 60-hour weeks at the publishing house to ensure our mortgage was paid while he networked at expensive lunches. I was the foundation he stood on to look tall. And then there was Amber. Amber was my oldest friend, or so I thought. She was a freelance graphic designer who always seemed to be between contracts. She spent her days lounging in my living room, drinking my coffee, and complaining about the unfairness of the universe. I offered her freelance gigs. I paid for our dinners. I listened to her endless crises. I had structured my life around supporting them. But in their narrative, I was just the background scenery. They would spend hours discussing Ryan's visionary ideas and Amber's creative genius. If I spoke about my own career, their eyes would glaze over. I was a utility, not a person. A reliable appliance they plugged into when they needed resources. The betrayal didn't start the day Ryan packed his bags. It started 1,000 tiny times over 5 years. It started when Ryan bought Amber an expensive birthday gift using our joint account, claiming it was a necessary networking expense. It started when they took a weekend trip to a coastal town to brainstorm branding, leaving me behind to finalize a manuscript deadline. They gaslit me into believing I was simply being unsupportive if I questioned their bond. My late husband, Thomas, had been different. Thomas was a quiet, steady presence. He had died in an accident shortly after we were married, leaving a void I had desperately tried to fill with Ryan. Thomas had seen me. He had valued my mind and my independence. It made perfect sense that Thomas's final act of care, deferred for years in a locked trust, was designed to sever me from parasites. Ryan and Amber thought I was oblivious. They thought my silence was stupidity. But an editor reads every word, notes every inconsistency, and tracks every timeline. I had seen the lingering looks. I had noticed the unexplained withdrawals. I had simply chosen to endure it because the invisible chain of my own making convinced me it was my duty to keep the peace. I was the silent investor in their fraudulent enterprise. But the beauty of being the invisible architect is that you know exactly where the load-bearing walls are. You know precisely which supports to pull to bring the entire structure crashing down, and I was ready for the demolition. The silence lasted exactly 48 hours. Then the predators realized the trap had been sprung. I was sitting at my kitchen island, reviewing my attorney's expedited filing strategy, when my phone began to vibrate. It was Ryan. I ignored it. Then came the texts. Then the aggressive pounding on my front door. I didn't flinch. I walked to the door and opened it, leaving the chain engaged. Ryan and Amber stood on the porch. Ryan's face was flushed with anger, while Amber wore a mask of calculated concern. "You locked the accounts," Ryan demanded, his voice echoing in the quiet hallway. "My card declined at a business lunch. What kind of petty game are you playing?" "It is not a game, Ryan. It is accounting," I replied, my voice devoid of emotion. "I am no longer funding your lifestyle." Amber stepped forward, attempting to look sympathetic. "Natalie, please. We know you're hurting, but cutting us off financially is just vindictive. We need to talk about the inheritance." I froze, though I didn't let it show on my face. The $77 million. My attorney had sent the formal divorce declaration to Ryan's legal representative that morning. The paperwork must have included the mandatory financial disclosures, exposing the impending trust transfer. "There is nothing to talk about," I said flatly. "We've been married for 5 years, and during that time, we've commingled our finances and businesses. That money represents the growth of our shared life, and I'm entitled to my fair share of the marital estate. We were married for 5 years. I supported you emotionally. Amber was your best friend. You owe us a fair settlement." The audacity was almost clinical. They had discarded me, yet they felt entitled to the severance package. They weren't shocked by their own betrayal. They were shocked that I was keeping the payout. "You supported me emotionally?" I repeated, analyzing the statement like a flawed line of text. "You drained my savings and slept with my best friend. That is not support. That is theft. If you don't agree to a settlement, I will drag this divorce out for years," Ryan threatened, leaning closer to the door gap. "I will contest every single asset. Your lawyer said you need this finalized in 30 days to get the payout. You sign over 10 million, and I will sign the papers today. If you don't, you lose all of it." It was a classic extortion tactic. He was trying to leverage my timeline against me. Amber nodded in agreement. "Just be reasonable, Natalie. Don't let your bitterness ruin your windfall." I looked at them, truly observing them for the first time without the lens of affection. They were parasites, panicking because the host had detached. They thought fear would force my hand. "My attorney handles all negotiations," I said, my tone absolute ice. "Do not come to my house again." I shut the door and locked the deadbolt. My phone immediately lit up with a barrage of texts from Ryan, threats of lawsuits, gaslighting messages about my mental state, demands for his rightful share. I didn't reply. I simply took screenshots and forwarded them to my lawyer. They thought they were applying pressure. They were just providing evidence. The next morning, I sat in my attorney's sleek downtown office. My lawyer, a sharp, relentless woman named Evelyn, reviewed the screenshots of Ryan's extortion attempts. She didn't offer sympathy, which I appreciated. She offered strategy. "He is attempting to hold the timeline hostage," Evelyn stated, tapping her pen against the desk. "He knows about the 30-day condition on Thomas's trust, but Ryan has a vulnerability. He is sloppy. Execute a forensic audit of our entire financial history." I instructed. "Every business account, every credit card, every loan application from the past 5 years. He claims he wants an equitable division of assets. Let us ensure the court sees exactly what those assets are." Evelyn smiled, a predator recognizing a peer. "I will file the motion for full discovery immediately." The counterattack was silent, swift, and devastating. I didn't engage in screaming matches. I didn't argue with them over text. I simply unleashed professional scrutiny on their chaotic lives. Within 3 days, the subpoenas hit. Ryan's so-called tech consulting firm was suddenly subjected to a microscopic financial review. Amber's freelance design accounts, which she had linked to Ryan's business for tax purposes, were frozen pending investigation. I watched the panic unfold in real time through the frantic emails Ryan's cheap lawyer sent to Evelyn. They were terrified. They requested extensions. They pleaded for informal mediation. They offered to drop their demand for $10 million down to $2 million, then $1 million. I refused every offer. This wasn't revenge. It was a structural dismantling. I was not fighting to protect the $77 million. I was fighting to obliterate their credibility. Ryan left 3 voicemails in one afternoon. His arrogant threats had dissolved into desperate pleading. "Natalie, you have to stop the auditors. They are digging into vendor contracts. It's going to ruin my business reputation. Please, just call off your dogs and we can settle this quietly." I listened to the messages with analytical detachment. I didn't gloat. I didn't reply. I just continued my routine. I drank my morning coffee, edited my manuscripts, and watched the digital dashboard of my legal proceedings. I was the silent investor calling in all my debts. Amber tried a different tactic. She showed up at my office building, waiting by the elevators. She looked unkempt, her polished facade cracking under the stress. "You are destroying us," she hissed as I walked past. "Ryan's investors are pulling out because of the audit. You have millions of dollars waiting for you." "Why are you doing this?" I stopped and looked her directly in the eye. "I am simply balancing the ledger. You wanted an accounting of our shared assets. You are getting one." I walked away, leaving her standing in the lobby, staring after me. I didn't feel triumph, only the cold, sterile satisfaction of watching a flawed system correct itself. They had mistaken my previous silence for weakness. They had assumed I would simply absorb the cost of their betrayal to keep the peace. They were now learning the hard way that silence is the sound a trap makes right before it snaps shut. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for my floor. The purge was almost complete. On day 18 of the 30-day deadline, Evelyn called me into her office for an emergency meeting. When I walked in, she didn't offer a greeting. She simply turned her monitor so I could see the spreadsheet on the screen. "Your husband isn't just a terrible businessman, Natalie," Evelyn said, her voice dropping to a serious octave. "He is a felon." I looked at the documents. They were loan applications and investment contracts dating back 3 years. They secured over $400,000 in venture capital for Ryan's firm. At the bottom of each document was my signature, naming me as the primary financial guarantor. "I didn't sign these," I said, my voice analytical and flat. "I know," Evelyn replied. "We cross-referenced the metadata. The digital signatures were authorized from an internet protocol address registered to Amber's apartment." Amber, with her background in tech-savvy freelance design, had utilized specialized software to replicate the biometric markers on the digital documents. She had always been obsessed with the illusion of the good life and had spent months researching the exact financial protocols required to bypass institutional security, treating the fraud like a high-stakes design project. "They forged your signature to secure $500,000 in business loans. If his company defaulted, the banks would have seized your assets. They mortgaged your future to fund their present. This isn't just a breach of contract. It's a clear-cut case of identity theft and bank fraud, which are federal offenses." I've already contacted the authorities and provided them with the verified audit trail linking the fraudulent loan applications to his IP address. I stared at the forged signatures. This shifted the case entirely. This was no longer a messy civil divorce proceeding. This was a federal crime, massive, documented felony fraud. It perfectly illustrated the illusion of power of an empty wallet. Ryan and Amber had operated on the delusion that wealth equals worth. They didn't understand the difference between having and being. They believed that by stealing resources, by forging signatures to rent a status they hadn't earned, they could fake consequence and power. But a rented life is fragile. When you build your entire identity on stolen capital, your power is just a hollow shell. The moment the money vanishes, the facade collapses, leaving only the empty, desperate reality of who they truly were. They had nothing internal to stand on. "What is our next move?" I asked, looking up from the monitor. "I have already forwarded the forensic report to the district attorney," Evelyn said with a lethal smile. "The police will be executing arrest warrants for both of them by the end of the day. The extortion regarding your divorce settlement is over. A judge will expedite the dissolution of marriage immediately under these circumstances. I drove back to my apartment. The timeline was secure. The 77 million was safe. But more importantly, the ledger was permanently closed. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, my phone rang. It was an unknown number. I answered it. "Natalie." It was Ryan. He sounded out of breath, frantic. "The police are at my office." Amber just got arrested at her apartment. Through the glass wall, I saw Evelyn calmly reviewing another case file while juggling a call on her second line. Her focused demeanor a stark contrast to Ryan's panic. "You have to tell them it was a misunderstanding. You have to tell them you authorized those loans." "I am an editor, Ryan," I said, my voice cold and precise. "I do not authorize fiction." I hung up and blocked the number. The illusion was shattered. Their rented status had expired, and the bill had finally come due in spectacular fashion. I closed my laptop, walked to the window, and looked out over the city. I didn't feel sorry for them. I felt absolutely nothing but clinical closure. They had tried to outmaneuver me with gaslighting and extortion, but they had tripped over their own greed. I poured a glass of ice water and waited for the final verdict. The divorce was practically finalized. The end game was here. Day 26. The courtroom was practically empty, save for my attorney, Evelyn, myself, and the presiding judge. Ryan and Amber were present, but they were unrecognizable, shackled in orange jumpsuits, their arrogance replaced by the hollow stare of those facing a decade behind bars. The judge carefully reviewed Evelyn's expedited filings. The forensic evidence was undeniable. The metadata from the forged signatures was ironclad. The extortion attempt was meticulously documented in dozens of hostile emails and texts. Given the severe and documented criminal actions of the respondent, including targeted financial fraud against the petitioner, the court has reached a decision. Based on the overwhelming evidence of criminal fraud presented, the court hereby issues a summary judgment for the dissolution of marriage, effectively bifurcating the status from the property division to grant immediate relief. This dissolution of marriage is granted immediately, with extreme prejudice. The petitioner is fully severed from all shared liabilities and retains 100% of her individual assets. It was over. The accounting was finished. I walked out of the courthouse as a legally single woman. The air outside felt crisp, clear, and entirely my own. 4 days later, on day 30, Thomas Holloway's trust executed the final transfer. Exactly $77 million materialized in my secure, private accounts. It wasn't just a financial inheritance. It was a massive, impenetrable shield, carefully forged by a man who had truly seen my worth, designed to protect me from those who refused to. I didn't buy a sprawling mansion. I didn't purchase a fleet of luxury cars. My very first act of business was establishing a comprehensive venture capital fund exclusively for independent women entrepreneurs. I wanted to build solid financial foundations for women who had spent their lives acting as the invisible architects for ungrateful, parasitic men. I wanted to fund their absolute independence so they would never have to endure a psychological prison without bars just to keep the peace. Ryan and Amber were eventually indicted and convicted. Ryan was sentenced to 4 years in a federal correctional facility. Amber received 3. Their professional networks abandoned them overnight. Their reputations were entirely obliterated. They had tried to destroy me for temporary financial gain, but in the end, their own unchecked greed had signed their arrest warrants. I watched them dismantle their own lives, and I didn't lift a single finger to save them. As I sit here today, looking over the brilliant proposals for the new Women's Foundation, the cold, clinical anger has completely faded. It has been replaced by a deep, resonant, and unshakable peace. I've come to realize that the most profound victories don't look like explosive, chaotic revenge. They look like quiet, unstoppable growth. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free. But forgiveness does not mean reconciliation. It simply means releasing their hold on your future and walking away. To anyone listening to this, to those who have spent years feeling invisible, acting as the silent background character in your own life, this is a letter to those who always feel on the edges. I know your deep exhaustion. I know the quiet, heavy ache of being reliable, compliant, and constantly overlooked. I know exactly what it costs to swallow your own voice just to keep the peace for people who would gladly watch you drown. But please hear me. You are not a background character. Your quiet endurance is not a weakness. It is a forged steel reserve. You have the absolute power to stop being the silent investor in relationships that bankrupt your spirit. You have the right to close the ledger. Step into your own light, reclaim your narrative, and never apologize for protecting your peace. If you believe justice is the best revenge, share this story with someone who needs a reminder of their own worth. Don't forget to subscribe for more tales of resilience.